Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're setting sail, figuratively, of course, across a calm, imaginary ocean. So, if you're already tucked in, lights low, maybe a cat curled somewhere at your feet, congratulations. You're ready for a 90-minute exploration of one of history's most famous navigational mishaps. Because tonight, we're talking about Christopher Columbus, the man who somehow convinced Spain to fund his midlife crisis, and in doing so, accidentally kicked off about 5 centuries of chaos, colonization, and cartographic confusion. So, let's dim the lanterns, pour something soothing, and drift back to the late 1400s, a time when the world map looked like a medieval doodle. Half the population thought sea monsters were real, and rich monarchs were basically funding human GPS experiments. The 15th century in Europe was a mood. On one hand, people were finally emerging from the medieval funk. There was art, trade, and a vague sense that washing might be a good idea. On the other, everyone was obsessed with finding new trade routes to Asia, because Asia, at the time, was like the Amazon prime of the medieval world, full of spices, silk, and all the luxury goods Europe didn't have, but desperately wanted. There was just one problem: the Ottoman Empire. They'd inconveniently blocked overland routes, charging tolls so high even the wealthiest merchants were reconsidering their life choices. So, enter the sailors, or as I like to call them, the people who looked at a globe shaped object and said, "What if we just go the other way?" Portugal was leading the pack, sending explorers south around Africa. Spain, meanwhile, was late to the party, mostly because they'd been busy kicking the Moors out of Granada and hadn't yet figured out which direction was up in maritime politics. And then, into this climate of nautical ambition and royal impatience, walked a man who truly believed he could find a shortcut to Asia by going west. His name, as you've guessed, was Cristoforo Colombo, a Genoese wool worker's son with dreams bigger than his geography education. Christopher Columbus was born around 1451 in Genoa, Italy, though if you asked him later in life, he preferred to sound a little more mysterious about it. His early life was fairly normal. He probably helped his father in the family business, learned to sail young, and developed an unhealthy fascination with maps and Marco Polo. Columbus wasn't exactly well educated, but he had ambition, that dangerous, glittering kind that makes a man think he can persuade monarchs to pay for his pet theories. And his pet theory was simple and wrong. He believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. So small, in fact, that you could sail west from Europe and hit Asia before your crew ran out of patience or protein. Now, to be fair, most educated people at the time already knew the Earth was round. Contrary to the common myth, no one thought you'd fall off the edge of the world. What they did think, however, was that Columbus's math was bad. Like, we're all gonna die in the ocean. Bad. And they were right. But Columbus was not a man who let facts get in the way of destiny. He spent years pitching his voyage idea around Europe. Portugal said no. England said no. France probably rolled its eyes. And finally, he landed in Spain, where King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were in that post war, let's make Spain great again mood. At first, they also said no. But after a few years, a lot of lobbying, and maybe a little divine guilt tripping, Isabella finally relented. In 1492, she agreed to fund his voyage westward, partly because she hoped to spread Christianity, and partly because, well, what's the worst that could happen? The deal Columbus struck was generous, suspiciously so. If he succeeded, he'd be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, become Viceroy of any lands he found, and get a cut of the profits. It was basically a startup deal with zero oversight and infinite ego. Spain gave him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And because naming conventions were boring even then, most of these were nicknames. The Santa Maria was technically called La Gallega, but historians and bedtime narrators alike stick to the catchy ones. The crew? About 90 men. Sailors, adventurers, and a few who were probably just avoiding debt collectors. The captain of the Pinta, Martin Alonso Pinzon, was an experienced navigator who actually knew what he was doing, which is fortunate because Columbus didn't. So, on August 3rd, 1492, they set sail from Palos de la Frontera, a small Spanish port that probably smelled like fish, sweat, and optimism. Columbus was heading west, convinced he'd reach Asia in a matter of weeks. He was wrong by an entire continent. The voyage across the Atlantic wasn't glamorous. Food went bad. Water turned into soup. People got seasick, cranky, and extremely tired of salted meat. Columbus, ever the motivational speaker, kept 2 sets of logs, one real, one fake. In the real one, he recorded the actual distance they'd traveled. In the fake one, he downplayed it, so the crew wouldn't realize just how far from home they actually were. It was basically medieval gaslighting. As days turned to weeks, tensions rose. The crew started grumbling. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Some wanted to turn back. Columbus, however, remained delusionally confident. Then, on October 12th, 1492, just before dawn, land was spotted. A sailor named Rodrigo de Triana on the Pinta reportedly shouted, "Tierra," though Columbus, being Columbus, later claimed he'd seen it first. Because of course he did. They had reached what we now know as the Bahamas. Columbus, however, believed he'd reached the outer islands of Asia, probably somewhere near Japan. He called the local people Indios because he thought he was in the Indies, and that small navigational error would shape centuries of history, misunderstandings, and geography lessons. The native Taino people greeted Columbus's arrival with curiosity. They offered gifts, food, and friendliness because they didn't yet realize that European contact was usually followed by disaster. Columbus was impressed by their kindness, their gold jewelry, and their lack of weaponry. In his journal, he wrote with a mixture of fascination and opportunism, noting that the people were so naive and would make good servants. A true man of the Renaissance. Over the next weeks, Columbus explored nearby islands, what we now know as Cuba and Hispaniola, modern Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. He continued insisting he was somewhere off the coast of Asia, blissfully unaware he'd stumbled onto an entirely new continent. Maps, of course, would take decades to catch up. He planted crosses, made grand speeches, and claimed land for Spain. Standard European procedure for finders keepers. He also left behind a small colony on Hispaniola before sailing home to report his discovery. When he returned to Spain in early 1493, he was welcomed as a hero. Bells rang, crowds cheered. He paraded a few bewildered Taino captives through the streets as proof of his success. Because ethics were optional in the 15th century, he promised gold, spices, and converts, everything the Spanish crown wanted to hear. And so, Naturally, they funded another voyage. Let's take a slow breath here. Because while Columbus was about to become the poster child for exploration, his story was far from over and far from glorious. So, when we last left Columbus, he'd just returned to Spain, glowing with pride and maybe a little scurvy. He'd discovered the New World, or rather, accidentally stumbled onto it, and Spain was thrilled. After all, he'd promised riches, exotic lands, and millions of potential converts. In reality, he had found beaches, a few shiny trinkets, and several confused islanders wondering why these bearded strangers kept planting flags everywhere. But Columbus was a master of marketing. He told King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella exactly what they wanted to hear. He showed them gold ornaments, parrots, and even brought along a handful of Taino people, because apparently that counted as proof. And with his signature blend of overconfidence and selective honesty, he convinced Spain to fund another expedition. The second voyage, launched in September 1493, was much larger, 17 ships and around 1,200 men. That's right, Spain went from "let's see what happens" to colonial empire starter pack in less than a year. This time, Columbus wasn't just exploring, he was colonizing. He had priests to convert the locals, soldiers to enforce order, and nobles to claim the spoils. Basically, it was a 15th century corporate expansion, minus HR, ethics, or working maps. When the fleet arrived back in the Caribbean, they found that the small colony Columbus had left on Hispaniola was gone, completely wiped out. Apparently, the settlers had managed to annoy the local Taino population so thoroughly that the entire group was killed. Columbus's reaction? He immediately began building another colony, because clearly the first failure was just a warm-up. He named it La Isabella, after the queen, though, in hindsight, La Disaster might have been more accurate. The settlers were unprepared for tropical life. They couldn't grow European crops. Half the men got sick, and the other half got into fights. Columbus, meanwhile, was trying to run a colony, manage rebellions, search for gold, and insist he was still somewhere in Asia. All at once, it was chaos. There's one thing Christopher Columbus was not built for. It was administration. Running a colony required diplomacy, patience, and basic management skills. He had none of these. He ruled with a mix of stubborn pride and bad temper. He imposed harsh punishments on both settlers and natives, sparking rebellions from both sides. By most accounts, his leadership style could be summarized as, if people complain, chain them up. Reports of his cruelty eventually reached Spain. Colonists accused him of tyranny. His brothers, who helped him govern, were no better. One was accused of public beatings, another of embezzlement. Basically, the Columbus family ran Hispaniola like a chaotic family business that didn't understand supply chains or morality. Still, Columbus was determined to find something to justify the mess, and that something was gold. Spain wanted returns, literal gold, but the Caribbean didn't have much. The Taino had small quantities, mostly decorative, which they traded willingly at first. But Columbus, needing results, began demanding tribute. Each adult Taino was required to bring a quota of gold every few months. If they didn't, punishment followed, brutal and unforgiving. This system quickly broke down, of course, because there simply wasn't that much gold. So, the tribute turned into forced labor, plantations, mines, and misery. This was the start of something that would grow darker over the next centuries. The European system of colonial exploitation that turned paradise into profit. And through all of it, Columbus clung to his delusion. He still believed he was in Asia. He still wrote letters describing India, Cipango, Japan, and Cathay, China, all while standing on Caribbean beaches. Spain wanted returns, literal gold. But the Caribbean didn't have much. The Taino had small quantities, mostly decorative, which they traded willingly at first. But Columbus, needing results, began demanding tribute. Each adult Taino was required to bring a quota of gold every few months. If they didn't, punishment followed, brutal and unforgiving. This system quickly broke down, of course, because there simply wasn't that much gold. So the tribute turned into forced labor, plantations, mines, and misery. This was the start of something that would grow darker over the next centuries. The European system of colonial exploitation that turned paradise into profit. And through all of it, Columbus clung to his delusion. He still believed he was in Asia. He still wrote letters describing India, Cipango, Japan, and Cathay, China, all while standing on Caribbean beaches. It's almost impressive, really, the sheer commitment to being wrong. It's almost impressive, really, the sheer commitment to being wrong. By 1498, Columbus was back for a third voyage. He was older, more stressed, and probably realizing that running an empire was harder than pitching one. This time, he sailed further south, reaching the coast of modern Venezuela, making him the first European to set foot on the South American mainland. He was impressed by the lush landscape and abundant rivers. But when locals mentioned huge cities and gold further inland, he thought he'd found the outer edge of the earthly paradise. Yes, Columbus was now convinced he'd found the entrance to Eden, which is not how geography works. He returned to Hispaniola, only to find the colony in open revolt. The settlers were starving, furious, and ready to overthrow him. Columbus tried to restore order, but things were too far gone. Back in Spain, rumors were spreading that he'd lost control, mistreated his men, and possibly gone mad. Eventually, the crown sent a royal investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, to sort out the situation, and sort it out he did. Bobadilla arrived, took one look at the chaos, and immediately arrested Columbus. Yes, the great admiral of the ocean sea was sent home in chains. He wept the entire voyage back, though, given his flair for drama, he might have made sure everyone saw it. When Columbus arrived in Spain in 1500, he expected humiliation. Instead, Isabella ordered the chains removed and received him kindly, which, to be fair, was more mercy than he'd shown anyone else. Still, his reputation was damaged. He was stripped of his governorship, but allowed one more voyage, a final chance to redeem himself. In 1502, he set sail once again, this time with just 4 ships and a heart full of stubborn delusion. He explored parts of Central America, modern Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, still convinced he was skirting the edge of Asia. At one point, his ships were trapped in a storm, battered, and wrecked along the coast of Jamaica. He and his men were stranded for nearly a year. Supplies ran out, morale collapsed, and, in one of history's most bizarre power moves, Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to predict a lunar eclipse, convincing the local people that his god was angry and that they should feed his crew. It worked, because even at rock bottom, the man had showmanship. Eventually, he was rescued and limped back to Spain, sick, exhausted, and largely forgotten. The age of discovery had moved on without him. Columbus spent his final years writing letters, endless, rambling letters, demanding the titles and rewards he'd been promised. He insisted he had reached Asia. He begged for recognition, but the Spanish court, now focused on new conquests, had little interest in an old sailor with a bruised ego. He died in 1506, in Valladolid, convinced to his last breath that he'd found a new route to the Indies. He never knew he'd discovered an entirely new world. That revelation came later, when another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, figured it out. And yes, that's the guy America was named after, not Columbus. Imagine spending your whole life obsessed with fame and losing the naming rights to the intern. So, what do we make of Christopher Columbus? He was brave, certainly, though mostly in the too stubborn to quit sense. He was visionary, but catastrophically wrong. He was ambitious, devout, self-absorbed, and often cruel. A mix of explorer, zealot, and corporate PR man, all rolled into one sunburned sailor. He changed the world, but not in the way he imagined. His voyages connected continents, unleashed empires, and began centuries of cultural collision. For better or worse, the world that emerged after 1492 would never be the same again. Take a deep breath here. You can almost hear the faint echo of sails, the distant slap of oars, and a very confused man insisting he's in Asia. Because in the end, Columbus's story isn't one of discovery, it's one of delusion, persistence, and the power of being very sure about something completely wrong. Let's drift onward soon, because next time we'll gently wander into the world that came after Columbus, the scramble for the New World, the rivalry between Spain and Portugal, and the cartographic headache that followed. Welcome back, sleepy travelers. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through Columbus's entire existential crisis. Now, we're entering what came after, the great European land grab that turned a few sandy beaches in the Caribbean into the biggest global turf war in history. Because once Columbus came back with his tales of Asia that wasn't, everyone in Europe suddenly wanted a piece of whatever he'd found. Gold, glory, God. Pick your motivation. It was like the world's most aggressive real estate auction, and Spain showed up with the loudest bid. So let's rewind a bit. Back in 1493, word of Columbus's discovery reached the Vatican. Pope Alexander VI, who, by the way, was a Borgia and therefore allergic to subtlety, decided to step in. He issued a papal bull basically saying, Spain gets everything west of this imaginary line across the Atlantic. Portugal gets everything east simple, clean, entirely arbitrary. The following year, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, adjusting the line slightly to keep everyone's egos intact. And just like that, the two most Catholic nations on earth divided half the planet with a ruler and a quill. It's worth noting that no one else was consulted, not the indigenous peoples, not Africa, not even the fish. The line literally sliced through continents no European had even seen yet. But sure, paperwork done, problem solved. Spain got most of the Americas. Portugal got Brazil by sheer accident, and everything around Africa and Asia, England, France, and the rest of Europe, they were too busy squabbling, for now. Spain's golden age, or how to get rich and start a global problem, Spain suddenly had access to entire new continents. And unlike Columbus, who thought he was farming on the outskirts of China, later explorers quickly realized this was something else, a new world, which, naturally, meant new opportunities for gold, silver, and empire. Within a generation, Spain's explorers, or conquistadors, were marching across vast territories, armed with swords, cannons, and a staggering lack of humility. The pattern was simple: arrive, announce ownership in the name of the crown, and convert or conquer anything that moved. The results were complicated. Entire civilizations fell. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Aztecs, the Inca, collapsed under disease, deception, and steel. Spain got its gold. Europe got chocolate and syphilis. Everyone else got history's longest hangover. Meanwhile, Portugal was doing its own thing. They had pioneered the route around Africa, building a chain of trading posts from the Cape of Good Hope to India and beyond. While Spain was planting flags in the Caribbean, Portugal was busy setting up a trade monopoly that stretched across half the known world. Pepper, silk, sugar, and slaves. They were like the quiet cousin who doesn't talk much at family gatherings, but owns 3 companies. And though they got a smaller slice of the Americas, mostly Brazil, they made it count. Sugar plantations sprang up along the coast, worked by enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic. It was profitable and horrific, a grim foundation for what would become the global slave trade. As Europe scrambled to redraw maps, the people already living in the Americas found themselves caught in an impossible storm. Millions died from diseases brought by Europeans: smallpox, measles, influenza, against which they had no immunity. It's estimated that within a century of Columbus's arrival, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died. Whole cultures, languages, and traditions vanished almost overnight. But in Europe, the story was told differently. They called it discovery, civilization, a triumph. It's always easier to romanticize something when you're not the one being conquered. By the 1500s, Spain was rolling in wealth. Shiploads of silver and gold poured in from Mexico and Peru, so much that the Spanish crown could barely keep track. The city of Seville became the center of global trade. Spanish nobles built palaces, artists painted saints. The economy boomed, briefly. Then, predictably, it imploded. Massive inflation hit Europe. The flood of silver devalued currency. And Spain, ever the big spender, poured fortunes into endless wars. They basically achieved the medieval version of winning the lottery, buying 400 horses, funding 6 crusades, and then declaring bankruptcy. As the 16th century unfolded, maps became a nightmare for cartographers. Every year brought new discoveries, new coastlines, rivers, islands. Some were real, many were entirely made up. For a while, European maps of the Americas looked like someone had drawn them from memory after a fever dream. You'd find names like the Island of Giants or the Sea of Darkness. And of course, California was drawn as an island for over a century, because apparently double checking wasn't fashionable yet. Remember Columbus, dying in obscurity, still convinced he'd found Asia? Enter Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer who actually figured out what was going on. He sailed to South America in the early 1500s and realized, wait a minute, this isn't Asia. This is an entirely separate continent. He wrote about it. His letters spread across Europe, and a German mapmaker, Martin Waldseemüller, decided to name the New World after him, America. Columbus had risked everything, gotten lost 4 times, and spent years fighting for credit. And in the end, the branding went to Amerigo. It's like inventing the light bulb and watching your neighbor trademark Glowtech. Back in Spain, all this conquering needed justification because even the most devout monarchs knew they'd been a little enthusiastic. The church helped with that. Missionaries were sent to convert the heathens. Priests built churches beside fortresses, and colonial propaganda painted Spain as the bringer of salvation, a shiny moral coating over a very bloody reality. Some priests, like Bartolomé de las Casas, actually protested the cruelty. He argued that indigenous people were rational, intelligent, and deserved compassion. He was largely ignored, though his writings would later haunt Spain's reputation. Europe, predictably, just carried on. By the early 1500s, other European nations were catching on. France, England, and the Netherlands all wanted their own piece of the action. The French sent Jacques Cartier to explore Canada, a land so cold and rocky that he probably regretted his life choices immediately. The English sent John Cabot, who discovered Newfoundland, went home, and then vanished on his second voyage, possibly eaten by bad weather or bad planning. But these early efforts laid the groundwork for future empires, and soon the Atlantic became a busy, contested space, brimming with pirates, merchants, and explorers who all claimed to be discovering things already inhabited. It was, in short, the dawn of the global age. The old world and new world were now permanently connected by trade, by conquest, by tragedy. Let's pause a moment. You can almost hear the waves slapping against wooden hulls, the creak of ropes, and the soft scratching of quills, drawing yet another imaginary border. Because the discovery of America wasn't just a voyage, it was the beginning of a long, tangled web of greed, faith, and geography that would shape the next 500 years. Welcome back, dreamers. If you've made it this far, you've successfully survived Columbus, papal borders, and several imperial ego trips. Now it's time for the after party, Spain's so-called Golden Age, a glittering century of wealth, power, and complete fiscal chaos. Because, as it turns out, discovering new continents is the easy part. Actually running them, that's where the hangover begins. Let's start with the good news. In the early 1500s, Spain hit the geopolitical equivalent of winning the lottery twice. First, Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, 1519 to 1521. Then, Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca in Peru, 1532 to 1533. Both empires had cities filled with gold, silver, and precious stones. The Spanish, predictably, helped themselves. By mid-century, ships were leaving the Americas loaded with more silver than Europe had ever seen. The mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico became the beating heart of Spain's global wealth. So much silver poured out that Spain's royal accountants basically gave up trying to count it. It's said that during the height of production, Potosi alone produced enough silver to mint coins for the entire world, and still have leftovers for fancy church altars. The Spanish crown, of course, took a generous royal fifth of every shipment. Because if there's one thing monarchs love more than divine right, it's taxes now. Transporting all that wealth was no small task. The Atlantic was crawling with storms, pirates, and the occasional Englishman with a grudge. So, Spain developed a highly organized convoy system, the flota. Every year, fleets of armed galleons would sail from Seville to the Caribbean, gather silver from ports like Havana and Veracruz, and then cross the ocean together escorted by warships. It was basically the world's first armored Brinks truck system, except slower, leakier, and more likely to be eaten by fish. For a while, it worked beautifully. The fleets brought wealth, prestige, and a sense of divine destiny to Spain. Seville became one of Europe's richest cities, its docks piled high with crates of silver and spices. But wealth, as history repeatedly shows, rarely equals wisdom. Imagine what happens when you dump hundreds of tons of silver into an economy that still runs on barter and feudal rent. Yep, prices go wild. The 16th century saw Europe's first major inflation crisis, known as the Price Revolution. Wages stagnated, food prices skyrocketed, and peasants, as usual, suffered most. Spain, now swimming in silver, actually imported much of its goods from abroad. They spent their treasure on foreign luxuries, armies, and bad investments. Essentially, they exported silver and imported debt. Economists today might call it unsustainable. At the time, they called it God's will. Meanwhile, Spain wasn't just hoarding silver, it was hoarding souls. The Spanish monarchy saw itself as the sword arm of Catholicism. Missionaries fanned out across the Americas, baptizing, teaching, and occasionally bulldozing entire cultures in the name of salvation. Churches rose on top of temples. Indigenous gods were quietly, or not so quietly, replaced with saints. And somewhere in the process, a new hybrid world was born, one where European faith met native tradition, blending into something entirely new. It was complicated, messy, and often cruel, but it also shaped Latin America's unique cultural and spiritual identity, something that endures long after the conquistadors' banners turned to dust. While Spain was busy turning silver into sermons, its royal family was also expanding. Literally, the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, Joanna, Juana la Loca, or Joan the Mad, because medieval psychiatry was mostly name-calling, to Philip the Handsome of Austria, united Spain with the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Their son, Charles V, the man who inherited half of Europe before breakfast. By 1519, Charles was both King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, ruling over Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and inconveniently, the New World. His empire was so vast that it was said the sun never set on it, which sounds impressive until you remember that it also meant constant wars, revolts, and tax crises in every time zone. Charles spent most of his reign fighting the French, the Ottomans, the Protestants, and sometimes his own bankers. He traveled endlessly, trying to hold his sprawling empire together with treaties and charisma. But even emperors get tired. In 1556, Charles did something unthinkable for his time. He abdicated. He retired to a monastery in Spain, where he spent his last years praying, reading, and watching his empire slowly unravel like a poorly tied ship's rope. Before stepping down, he divided his realm. His brother Ferdinand got the Austrian lands and the imperial crown. His son Philip II got Spain, its colonies, and the headache that came with them. And so, Spain's golden age entered its next act, one of power, grandeur, and a steady slide into bankruptcy. Philip II ruled from 1556 to 1598, 4 decades of obsessive control and holy purpose. He rarely left Spain, preferring to rule from his palace monastery at El Escorial, surrounded by paperwork and religious advisors. If Charles V had been the restless emperor, Philip was the world's first work-from-home monarch. He built Spain into a superpower, but at a cost. Wars with England, France, and the Dutch Republic drained his treasury. The Inquisition flourished under his reign, policing heresy like a full-time job. And in 1588, he launched the Spanish Armada against Protestant England. The mission: invade, depose Elizabeth I, and restore Catholic dominance. Instead, the Armada was smashed by storms, English cannons, and bad luck. It limped home shattered, a floating metaphor for Spain's declining fortunes. Philip II ruled from 1556 to 1598, 4 decades of obsessive control and holy purpose. He rarely left Spain, preferring to rule from his palace monastery at El Escorial, surrounded by paperwork and religious advisors. If Charles V had been the restless emperor, Philip was the world's first work-from-home monarch. He built Spain into a superpower, but at a cost. Wars with England, France, and the Dutch Republic drained his treasury. The Inquisition flourished under his reign, policing heresy like a full-time job. And in 1588, he launched the Spanish Armada against Protestant England. The mission: invade, depose Elizabeth I, and restore Catholic dominance. Instead, the Armada was smashed by storms, English cannons, and bad luck. It limped home shattered, a floating metaphor for Spain's declining fortunes. Ironically, this period of decline produced some of Spain's greatest art and literature. While the treasury emptied, culture thrived. Painters like El Greco and Velázquez captured the grandeur and melancholy of empire. Writers like Cervantes, with his weary knight Don Quixote, gave Spain a mirror for its fading dreams. It was the perfect symbol, a nobleman chasing glory long after it had ceased to exist. Spain, too, was tilting at windmills, dreaming of past greatness, while the world moved on. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's golden age had dimmed. The silver fleets dwindled, colonies grew restless, and rival powers, England, France, and the Dutch, took the lead in trade and exploration. Spain still had vast lands, but little control. Its rulers grew weaker, its economy stagnant, and its glory largely ceremonial. And yet, in the quiet halls of old Spanish cities, the echo of that golden century still lingered, the faint hum of an empire that had once believed itself eternal. Take a slow breath. Imagine the docks of Seville at sunset, the last rays glinting off silver coins, the creak of ships readying to sail, and a monk somewhere quietly adding up numbers that don't make sense anymore, because that's what the empire left behind. Not just wealth, but the myth of it, a shining illusion that would haunt Spain long after the gold ran out. Hey there again, night scholars. If you're still listening, you've crossed an ocean, toppled a few empires, and watched Spain get rich, then broke, then existential. Now we're zooming out to the part of the story that affects everyone, everywhere. How one Genoese sailor's bad math ended up connecting the entire planet. Because when Columbus set sail in 1492, the world was basically a collection of regional chat rooms. Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas existed like disconnected servers, each with its own rules, economies, and playlists. But after 1492, someone finally turned on the Wi-Fi. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange. That massive swap of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the old world and the new. It was, without exaggeration, the biggest biological remix in human history. Let's start with the fun part: food. Before 1492, there were no potatoes in Europe, No tomatoes in Italy, no chocolate in Switzerland, and no chili peppers in Asia. Which means, and brace yourself, there was no pizza as we know it, no spicy curry, no chocolate bars. Basically, a culinary wasteland. From the Americas came a wave of new ingredients: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, chili peppers, and yes, tobacco, humanity's least nutritious export. These foods spread across the world like wildfire. Potatoes transformed diets in Europe. Corn became a staple in Africa and Asia. And chocolate, well, became a personality trait. In return, Europeans brought over their own set of gifts, things like wheat, sugarcane, cattle, and less endearingly, smallpox, measles, and influenza. It was a wildly uneven exchange. Europe got calories and wealth. The Americas got pandemics. The diseases that crossed the Atlantic were catastrophic. With no immunity to Old World pathogens, indigenous populations were decimated. Entire cities, villages, and kingdoms disappeared within decades. Scholars estimate that 50 to 90% of the native population of the Americas died within the first century after Columbus. It remains one of the largest population collapses in human history. Quiet, invisible, and devastating. Europe, meanwhile, experienced a population boom. The new crops from the Americas, especially potatoes and maize, increased nutrition and food security. In a grim twist, the death of millions in one hemisphere fueled growth in the other. Now, remember all that silver and sugar flowing from the Americas? It needed ships, labor, and infrastructure. And thus began one of humanity's darkest economic inventions, the Atlantic slave trade. By the mid 1500s, European colonizers realized they needed massive labor forces for plantations: sugar, tobacco, cotton. The indigenous populations had been decimated, and European settlers were few, so they turned to Africa. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch, English, and French traders began transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in what became the triangular trade. Ships carried goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and raw products, sugar, rum, tobacco, back to Europe. It was efficient, profitable, and horrifying. Over 12 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the ocean. Millions died along the way. The profits fueled Europe's industrial rise. The suffering built the modern world's foundation. And all of it, every transaction, every route, traced back to that first voyage in 1492. For a while, the Atlantic got all the attention. But by the 1560s, Spain had figured out another trick: how to sail from the Americas to Asia. From the port of Acapulco, massive ships, called Manila galleons, began crossing the Pacific to the Philippines, carrying silver from Mexico and Peru to trade for silk, porcelain, and spices from China and Southeast Asia. In return, Asian luxuries flowed into Europe through Spanish ports. It was globalization before the word existed, the first truly global trade loop, powered by wind, greed, and mildly terrified sailors. The world was, for the first time, connected, not just by letters or rumors, but by money, markets, and microbes. Amid all this chaos, indigenous and African peoples didn't just vanish into the background. They adapted, resisted, and sometimes reshaped the colonial world in ways historians often overlook. African merchants in West Africa negotiated fiercely with European traders, sometimes controlling access to captives and goods. In the Americas, indigenous groups forged alliances, launched rebellions, and even learned to play the imperial game, trading, navigating diplomacy, and using European rivalries to survive. Empires rise and fall, but human adaptability, that's the constant. As maps expanded, so did imaginations. Europeans now saw the world as one continuous system, something that could be measured, controlled, and owned. Cartographers drew the globe as a neat, navigable sphere. Merchants saw routes and profits. Priests saw souls to save, and kings saw bragging rights. But behind every clean line on a map were stories erased, the villages that vanished, the ecosystems that changed forever, the people who never got to draw their side of the story. By the late 1500s, global trade was in full swing. Silver from Peru flowed to China. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened European tea. And that tea came from Asia, shipped by Portuguese and later Dutch traders. It was all connected, an early form of capitalism fueled by empire. Europe's newfound wealth funded art, science, and exploration, the Renaissance on steroids. But it also created economic dependency and inequality that would echo for centuries. Every glittering coin from Potosi came with a ghost. Every loaf of sugar bread in Madrid came with a plantation's worth of suffering, and every new discovery was someone else's loss, written in fancy ink. By the 1600s, Europe had turned exploration into industry. The age of discovery became the age of domination. Colonies became corporations. Trade became conquest. Spain and Portugal's monopoly started cracking under the pressure of new rivals. England, France, and the Netherlands, all eager for a slice of the global pie. Pirates roamed the seas. Naval battles became blockbusters. And maps, once filled with blank spaces, became cluttered with European flags. Humanity had effectively circled the planet, not with curiosity, but with contracts. If Columbus could have seen what came next, he probably would have been confused, and maybe a little smug. His dream of reaching Asia by going west technically worked, just with a few unplanned continents in between. His voyage, born from miscalculation, launched centuries of expansion, exploitation, and exchange that reshaped the world beyond recognition. It's tempting to call it progress, but it's also a reminder that most progress comes with a price tag, often paid by people who never signed the bill. So now, picture it, the 16th century ocean, endless and dark, crisscrossed by ships, some carrying silver, some carrying souls, some just drifting into history. The wind hums through the rigging. The stars above are the same ones sailors used then, and the same ones we can still see now. It's the same world, only more connected, more complicated, and infinitely less innocent. The discovery of America wasn't one moment, it was a chain reaction, a story of navigation and nations, yes, but also of unintended consequences. It was the beginning of the modern world, for better and worse. When you trace the threads of globalization, of technology, of the world economy, they all lead back to a man on a creaky ship in 1492, squinting at the horizon and thinking he'd reached Japan. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to dream big, be wrong, and change everything anyway. So let's lower the sails and let the world go quiet again. The waves lap softly against the hull, the maps roll up, and the story of Columbus drifts finally into sleep. Because every empire, every voyage, every discovery eventually fades into the same sound, the slow, eternal hush of the sea. Hey there, night wanderers. When we last left off, Spain was basically the main character of the 1500s. Rich, shiny, and vaguely exhausted. They'd stumbled into global dominance thanks to a navigator who thought Cuba was Japan. But as every empire eventually learns, money can buy a lot of things except stability, good leadership, and self awareness. So let's float now through the 1600s, when Spain's golden age quietly turned into a long, luxurious nap, one it never quite woke up from. By the early 1500s, Spain's empire stretched from the Andes to the Philippines. It looked glorious on maps. So much red ink, so many little flags. But in reality, it was like trying to run an IKEA, the size of a continent with two managers who hate each other. Communication took months. Decisions were made by people who had never seen the places they ruled. And everyone, everywhere, wanted, hey again, night voyagers. We've followed Columbus from his hopeful delusion of a westward route to Asia, through Spain's golden glare and long decline, and now we find ourselves somewhere familiar, a world that still feels the ripples of those sails cutting across the Atlantic 5 centuries ago. It's funny, isn't it? The further we drift from 1492, the more it feels like we're still inside it. The maps changed, the names changed, the technologies changed, but the idea of discovery, that stayed. Because once the world learned that continents could be found, humanity never really stopped looking. After Spain and Portugal's first round of empire building, other European powers looked at the globe and basically said, cool idea, we'll take it from here. The British, the French, and the Dutch launched their own colonial experiments, smaller, slicker, and slightly less church obsessed. The 17th and 18th centuries were like a global game of Monopoly where nobody ever agreed on the rules. The British set up in North America and India. The French grabbed Canada and bits of Africa. The Dutch built their mercantile empire in Indonesia. And Spain just kept losing things. But here's the twist. All of them were living inside the system Columbus accidentally invented. A world defined by global trade, movement, and competition for distant resources. He didn't just discover America, he discovered how to globalize ambition. Of course, by the time the Enlightenment rolled around, people started asking awkward questions like, wait, was conquering half the world good? And why are we still calling it discovery when there were already people there? Philosophers and revolutionaries began to dismantle the old imperial story. The world was still connected, but now the conversations were about rights, freedom, and equality. The irony, of course, is that many of those lofty ideals were written by men profiting from the very systems they criticized. Still, the seeds of change were planted in the Americas. The colonies, once the jewels of Europe, started whispering about independence, and those whispers became revolutions. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the American continents were done being someone else's business model. The United States declared independence in 1776, powered by Enlightenment, philosophy, and unpaid labor. Then came the Latin American revolutions in the early 1800s, with figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín leading the charge. Spain's once mighty empire dissolved almost overnight. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru all carved new identities from the old colonial framework. It was messy, beautiful, and inevitably tragic. The empires fell, but their borders, hierarchies, and economies didn't just vanish. They stayed, fossilized into modern nations, because history, as always, doesn't end. It just changes its wardrobe. Europe, of course, didn't take the loss of its colonies as a sign to slow down. It just looked elsewhere. Africa, Asia, the Pacific. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. Industrial powers carving the continent into arbitrary shapes with straight rulers and zero shame. Columbus's ghost must have been proud. It was discovery rebranded, now with telegraphs and steamships. But the logic was the same. Find, claim, exploit, repeat. The 15th century sails had turned into 19th century smokestacks, but the horizon chasing instinct was identical. Meanwhile, the nation that literally called itself America began to inherit Europe's old imperial habits. By the late 1800s, the United States was expanding westward, displacing indigenous nations, just as Spain once had. It was manifest destiny, the belief that expansion was both inevitable and divinely justified. Basically, Columbus, with better logistics. By the early 20th century, the US was a global power, and in a beautifully ironic twist, it was now their turn to discover new worlds in the Philippines, the Pacific, and later, through Hollywood and capitalism, the entire planet. The empire Columbus set in motion had changed owners, but the software stayed the same. If you look around today, the foods we eat, the languages we speak, the money we use, the ships and planes and fiber cables that connect us, it all traces back to that first westward voyage. The Columbian Exchange never really ended. It just upgraded its infrastructure. Now it's container ships instead of caravels, airports instead of ports, emails instead of letters sealed with wax and suspicion. Sugar still flows, labor still moves, goods still cross oceans in search of cheaper hands. We just call it the global economy now because it sounds less medieval. And that's the strange, sleepy truth about Columbus. He didn't just find a continent, he triggered a system that's still unfolding. He's been praised as a hero, condemned as a villain, and rebranded as a controversial figure by PE. He's been praised as a hero, condemned as a villain, and rebranded as a controversial figure by people who don't like conflict. But honestly, he was just a man doing what ambitious men of his era did, trying to get rich, get famous, and get royal approval. The difference is, his particular brand of ambition changed the entire human story. Every October, people still argue about whether to celebrate him or not. But maybe the real takeaway is less about him and more about what he started. Our endless desire to explore, to possess, to connect, and the chaos that comes with it. Now, the explorers carried were laptops instead of compasses. They chart code instead of coastlines. The maps they draw are digital, but they're still maps, new ways to imagine and divide the world. In a sense, Columbus's voyage never ended. It just moved online. We're still mapping, still discovering, still expanding into invisible spaces. The next ocean being information, not water. It's the same instinct. Curiosity, greed, wonder, and a bit of confusion about where we're going. So let's close the book. Or, in this case, the logbook. Columbus set out chasing a dream and found something else entirely. Spain rose, ruled, and fell asleep under the weight of its own glory. Empires came and went. Trade routes turned into data cables, and the world, somehow, kept spinning. It's a story without an ending, because every age believes it's the one that finally understands the map, and every age eventually learns that the horizon always moves a little farther away. Picture it one last time: the Atlantic, calm and endless, The same stars, the same slow rhythm of the sea. Somewhere out there, a wooden ship creaks in the dark. A sailor looks out and mistakes a continent for an island. He writes in his log, thinking he's made it to Asia, and 500 years later, we're still living in the world that mistake created. History isn't loud. It's a quiet tide that never stops coming back. So tonight, as we drift away from this story, let's let the waves have the last word, because they were here before the ships, and they'll be here long after. Good night, traveler. You've reached the edge of the map. Hey again, night voyagers. We've left behind the age of sails and saints, those centuries of maps drawn in hope and hubris. Now we float into something louder, smokier, and somehow even stranger, because after Columbus's world of discovery came something far more unstoppable: invention. The world didn't just grow, it accelerated. It's the 18th and 19th centuries now. The seas still matter, but what really drives history is no longer the wind, it's the engine. And like most human inventions, the Industrial Revolution began with good intentions, a bit of greed, and a total lack of foresight about consequences. Let's start in Britain, because of course we do. The same nation that spent the previous centuries pirating, colonizing, and politely pretending it was all for civilization, somehow stumbled into a technological miracle. Coal, that black, dusty rock, became the beating heart of the modern world. It powered factories, trains, and ships. It darkened skies, lungs, and rivers. But hey, it made things faster. Steam engines turned labor into power. Spinning jennies made textiles by the ton. And locomotives, those roaring iron beasts, stitched entire continents together. Britain called it progress. The rest of the world called it exploitation with extra steps. While London filled with smog and money, colonies provided the raw materials: cotton, sugar, tea, rubber, people, all flowing one way through an ever expanding network of trade. It was the Columbian Exchange 2.0, now with better infrastructure and worse working conditions. By the mid 19th century, the British Empire was doing its best impression of the Roman one, but with railroads and red coats instead of legions. They built telegraph lines that stitched together the globe. A message could now cross the ocean faster than a ship could sink, which was quite an upgrade. And of course, the Victorians loved to tell themselves it was all very noble. The white man's burden, they called it, as if conquering India, Africa, and half the Pacific was an unfortunate chore. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria sat serenely on her throne, the grandmother of Europe, watching her empire expand across maps like ink spilled on parchment. By 1900, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and people. The sun, as they like to brag, never set on the British Empire, which was poetic, though for everyone under British rule, the sun mostly set on freedom. Of course, Britain wasn't the only one chasing industrial glory. France, eternally stylish and occasionally revolutionary, built its own empire, from North Africa to Indochina. The Dutch kept their lucrative grip on Indonesia, exporting spices, coffee, and the occasional sense of superiority. Even tiny Belgium got in on the fun, carving out the Congo with all the delicacy of a bull in a porcelain shop. King Leopold II turned the Congo into his personal business venture, where millions suffered for rubber and ivory, all while he built fancy gardens in Brussels. It was the 19th century's favorite paradox: progress powered by pain. Every invention seemed to come with a human cost, one conveniently paid by someone far away. And then, as history loves to do, everything exploded. The same industrial tools that built wealth also built weapons. Factories that once made rail lines and sewing machines could now churn out rifles, artillery, and battleships. By 1914, Europe had wired itself into a hyper connected web of alliances, egos, and very bad decisions. World War I arrived like an industrial accident, loud, smoky, and tragically efficient. Millions died in trenches, while generals argued about who was more honorable. The great empires that had strutted across the globe suddenly began to collapse under their own machinery. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved in paperwork. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated into borders drawn by diplomats with shaky hands. Russia imploded into revolution, and Britain and France, victorious, technically, were left holding the map, trying to redraw it in their favor, as usual. When the dust settled, the world was new again, or at least it pretended to be. Colonies rebranded as mandates. Old monarchies turned into democracies that still took advice from bankers. Factories rebuilt, faster and dirtier than before. Then, as if humanity hadn't learned its lesson, it happened again. World War II, the sequel nobody wanted. Now the machines could fly, the bombs could flatten cities, and the ideologies were industrial scale too. Fascism, communism, capitalism, all massive systems competing for global dominance. The war ended with cities in ashes and two new superpowers glaring at each other from opposite sides of the planet. Rome had fallen once. Europe's empires fell twice. And yet, somehow, the empire itself didn't die. It just changed hands.